Have you ever have you ever met people who are flat earther or who are flat Earth?
I didn't know that was a thing. Like, here, go with me on this. I'll explain. I thought that people were using it as a metaphor at first, okay? Saying like, oh, he's a flat earther, as in he believes in weird things, or he's ignorant, or he has fucked up ideas. But then somebody hipped me to this YouTube channel. This was like 5, 6 years ago now. And it was this dude who, he was some kind of like, aviation enthusiast. And he actually like flew like prop planes and stuff. And he believed quite literally in a flat earth. And he'd go up in his prop planes and say like, you see, like, if the Earth was, well, if there was like curvature to the Earth, even though we're only at like 15,000 feet, it wouldn't look like this. And I'm like, is this like a riff? Is this guy talking shit? And then I realized like, no, this dude like actually believes that the Earth is literally flat, that it's like a disc or something. or like, or like I don't even know
Yeah.
what to think of it. I think like like in those like goofy like Emanuel Jones riffs on this all the time. That old, like, I guess, like, Hindu fucking depiction where there's just, like, a turtle, and then there's, like, this kind of, like,
I like the
flat,
turtle,
like,
yeah.
yeah, like a chessboard almost looking thing, like, on his back. That's where, like, the meme, like, it's turtles all the way down comes from. But I had no idea there was quite literally, like some kind of, like, cult of, like, dudes who believe the Earth is literally flat. And it's like, why do they give a fuck? Like, but yeah, go ahead. Like, what's the deal?
Right, where are they going with it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, is there
what
anything
could be the
deeper than
end of
that?
all
That could
that?
be in,
Where
yeah. But, like, do you know? Is there anything deeper to it than that? Is it
I've
just like,
heard. I mean, it's weird because some people have a religious element to it, but some people don't, and it seems to be a lot of it is just a matter of wanting to be smarter than everyone or know more. I don't know, but yeah, it's a real thing. I've heard it's a big phenomenon with pilots where
huh?
they they're disproportionately into it. I guess they're looking
Well,
at that
that
flat
explains why this guy was like an
horizon.
aviator then, I guess. But I'll tell you what, it does have some merit, like, philosophically. Wolfgang Smith, who's a fascinating guy. He's a theologian. He writes a lot. He writes a lot about philosophy and the history of religion and the history of science. Like he's most known for writing about history, like texts about the history of science. But his theology and philosophy stuff is really really fascinating. And he talks about you know how there's very much a political um uh motive behind the push for heliocentrism be accepted, like and he obviously he uses this as a thought experiment. He's like, look, like what the center of a solar system is relative. Like there's no actual center to anything. He's framing it kind of like Zeno's paradoxes or something. Like he doesn't actually believe that like, oh, everything revolves around the Earth, but he's like people having like a hard as hell view on this. Obviously it was it had to do with the politics of the day and things. And he was using it kind of as an example as to like how science becomes politicized. And there are guys though who reject heliocentrism, like outright, for like theological reasons. And I understand that.
For religious, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but like
Yeah.
but like just claiming that the Earth is flat, like I don't, I don't
I
understand. Like,
mean,
yeah,
uh,
I don't understand what's behind it in terms of like
uh,
philosophy and ethics.
a lot of the implication is that there's that many people lying to you constantly, like going
Okay,
way
yeah,
out of
yeah,
their
yeah.
way to construct a false reality. So you like live in this world that's almost like a, it's almost like a Gnostic or like Manichaean kind of thing, where you can't escape, the lies of it. Where because there'd be however many people, and I mean, just how many people would work for NASA or to conduct any of these,
No,
these
that
big
I get
conspiracies to
that.
pull that off and not tell anybody.
Yeah, that I guess. Yeah, no, that makes perfect
You
sense. That's what it is. It's a narrative that suggests that consensus reality is just a deliberate confabulation, and people are, yeah, it's gonna dumb down neo-Gnostic or Neoplatonist sensibility, and that's very attractive to people, man. And like conspiracy think generally. The reason people become so attached to it and get so mad, when you kind of impeach the credibility of such things, is because I think they've got they perceive instinctively that something is wrong, something is very wrong. They can't really apprehend what that thing is, and they don't really understand kind of the complexity of political power at scale and sociological phenomena at scale. So they kind of latch on to these reductionist explanations for things, the sum of which, in aggregate terms, is greater than its parts, and they become very attached to it because it comes to symbolize, what everything that they correctly perceive. I'm talking about like in moral terms is wrong with the world, and it becomes kind of the overarching structure of their value system. That's I don't know what that actually went over my head, but no, you're absolutely right, man. That's insightful.
No, I think it comes from a feeling of powerlessness, and that it kind of reinforces that powerlessness, because at the end of the day, you're like, there's nothing that can be done.
What I will say is
there's
this,
no escaping this.
No, indeed. What I will say is this. I've made the point before, one of the favorite kind of malapropisms these days of regime media is called conspiracy theory. Like, for example, if you criticize, the corruption of the Biden family, it's like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Which, it's not, that's a literal malapropism, like objecting to something, or objecting to the fact that, mail-in voting isn't truly secure in conventional senses. It's not a, quote, conspiracy theory. However, there are people, and I believe there's more of them than there were a generation ago, probably, although, how could one quantify such things, who are true conspiracy theorists. But I make the point to people, like the other day when you and I were talking, I raised Maury Terry, who was the investigative journalist who wrote about the Son of Sam. Now, what he exposed in his book, The Ultimate Evil, which is a great and very disturbing book, it's not a, quote, conspiracy in conventional senses, but Maury Terry was saying way back in the 70s and 80s, like, look, he's like in elite corridors, he's like, there's very sick people. One of the ways these people kind of vet each other is through, deviant activities like shared in common. All right, there's a pragmatic side to this because it tends to, it creates, bonds, not of affection or of loyalty from in any genuine sense, but, it's initiatory, but it also like gives people dirt on one another. And he made the point that, like, this kind of sexual deviancy, whether we're talking about child abuse or whether we're talking about, various sex paraphilias that, are revolting to the people who are not, disturbed in that way. He's like, this is a lot more common than people think. And I think in the, in the post-Epstein, post-Jimmy Savile world, I think this has been exonerated, okay? But the problem is that a lot of the people who most publicly kind of seize on those things and are most visible in kind of promulgating these news stories are people like QAnon weirdos, and then it becomes this like goofy thing about, oh, they're harvesting adrenochrome and the Earth is flat and the moon landing was faked and blah blah blah. And then, people just kind of tune out when you talk about this, the actual nature of elite corruption, because it's become inextricably bound up with these moronic kind of narratives. Like Pizzagate. Okay,
it's like you said. It's like you said about flat earthers. Initially, you think that that's just a slur because nobody adopted that. So you think, oh, you believe crazy things, but now you're conflated with people who really do. Because people have adopted these things, and now they conflate the whole thing. And any conspiracy theorist actually, like, legit, they accuse most people of being disinfo. In fact, other conspiracies as disinfo. So it goes really deep down. But in the end, it doesn't change the narrative, whether people are harvesting adrenochrome or not. Like, it's the same these people, that the enemies don't change. It just makes them seem more powerful, more like you can't stop it. They the power is here, and also they control any resistance too. So there's no real potential for if someone arose to fight against it, people would say that they're in the same camp as well, and it's a false opposition, because that's out there as well.
No,
like
exactly.
False flags and so on and so forth.
No, it's born of the frustration experienced by the powerless. Very much so. It's very much. I mean, the term "cope" is overused and become kind of a dumb meme, but that really is like a coping mechanism. And I made the point before to people that very, very strange ideas, not just of a conspiratorial and obviously like, kind of preposterous and stupid nature, or character rather, but when people, if you believe in God and you understand, or not understand, you accept that providential causes are, kind of the quote invisible hand in history, or the cunning of reason, I think in rather Hegelian terms, the world becomes a lot more accessible, okay? If you literally believe that the only events, or the only proximate cause of really epochal events is man, and like, man's decisions, like individually and in aggregate terms, you're kind of left on this kind of intellectual hamster wheel, where you're constantly trying to tease out, like where decisions are being made that facilitate this, which then leads to that, and not only is that not the way human societies are structured at scale, but man really isn't in the driver's seat. And even if you're like some kind of agnostic or something, and you don't believe, literally in, the hand of God and in historical events, and as kind of the prime move on of those events, it's almost like the law of large numbers. Like when you're talking about millions upon millions upon millions of decisions in aggregate, which come to constitute the apparatus of state in massively scaled modern societies. This takes on characteristics that are greater than any discrete component, and but people also, they either they're not capable of apprehending that, or they don't really know where to begin in terms of like understanding that. So I guess it's just easier to believe that there's some kind of centralized there's some kind of like centralized apparatus of power, and everybody who's involved with it, has basically goals in common, and it's kind of a stand-in for both God and the devil, because it's the prime mover on the proximate cause of everything. And obviously, if that's your stand-in for God, or like your ersatz, like like Lucifer, like all bow before it, because who could duel with God or the devil and win? I believe that. I know it sounds melodramatic, right, but I believe that in psychological symbolic terms is quite literally what the phenomenon can be described as. And to your point too, I want to turn over to you in a second. These days, a lot more people believe in that kind of nonsense than before. Not because people have gotten more foolish, but people have in fact gotten more, conspiracy-minded in actual terms, because people, the world hasn't become more complex, but in terms of the day-to-day stimulus people are exposed to, and in terms of the things that constitute, the narratives that are presented by apparatus of state, or by, non-state actors and NGOs and IGOs, that wield tremendous power, like a lot of common people, or regular people, day-to-day taxpayer types, they're not, it's like an oversaturation of complex information, and like being unable to make any sense of that, they kind of take the path of least resistance in subconscious terms. But yeah, I mean, I glean that you very much believe that this kind of thought has become far more ubiquitous than 20 years ago or something. Am I right?
Very much so. I think. I mean, the big one, kind of back in the day, would be 9/11, the 9/11 truth.
Yeah, that's
where
kind of
you'll
faded,
say
it
it's
seems.
an inside job. It's definitely faded. It didn't really go anywhere. They never really got who was really responsible. You know, they didn't find the real perpetrators. And something I noticed that they would never really argue for the guys who were like accused of 9/11. They'd never say Obama or Bin Laden was innocent, or I mean, they just killed they just killed Doctor Z Zawahiri with the knife bomb, and I never
Yeah,
heard any from a drone. But you never hear the 9/11 truthers be like, you know, this man was innocent. You know, you can't,
right.
you didn't do,
Well, it's
you
also
didn't do
weird.
it. You know,
What's weird about them too, because in their kind of heyday, if we can call it that. See, like I assumed what they were saying is I assumed that they were presenting an argument common to what people said about Roosevelt and Admiral Kimmel. That well, Kimmel knew that the Japanese Imperial Navy was going to attack, and Kimmel was basically he was ordered in so many words to to essentially like be a decoy, okay, or be a honey trap, okay, to draw a Japanese assault, okay. I don't believe that. There was definitely attack indicators, and yes, Roosevelt was absolutely trying to provoke an incident. I don't think Kimmel was involved in that. I think in the case of Kimmel, it was incompetence. However, that claim, that's not some crazy claim, and actually that would make perfect sense considering the
right?
intentions and the ambitions of the New Dealers and of the players at the time. So I figured 9/11 truthers at first were saying, well, Bush wanted a war catalyst. The neocons were like, these rabid Zionists, and they wanted some kind of pretext for a general war against Dar al-Islam. But then I realized these 9/11 truth guys were like, no, this, the federal government did this. It was a controlled demolition. Blah blah blah. And so, why would they do that? And so the response was, well, of course, to like erect a police state. I'm like, you don't need to kill 3,000 people to erect a police state. You can just do it. And if you want some kind of pretext relating to terrorism, you can claim like, oh, we just arrested these 6 guys who were, planning to murder the president or something. You don't need to like actually blow up the World Trade Center. And people don't believe me. I refer to
Right.
COVID. Okay, like, however you feel about COVID, whatever. I'm not saying COVID was fake, but it was obviously an example of like a gross overreaction to something, and the government didn't have to, go kill 1 million people to convince everybody to, essentially put themselves on house arrest. Okay, so that's what was weird about it with the 9/11 thing, and nobody could ever seem to articulate, at least to me, or maybe they just thought that like I was one of them or something, or they just thought I was stupid because like I didn't accept their narrative. Nobody could explain to me like why the regime would go to the trouble to do this. And um it just didn't make any sense on its face. Not because the regime are good guys, but because it's like why would they bother with that?
Right. Even they'll say, I mean, they say it's a controlled demolition, okay, but I mean, wouldn't you just say that the terrorists planted those bombs, not like do the controlled demolition and orchestrate like these huge theatrics with the planes crashing in as well? Like
Well,
we need
yeah,
to
and
make it very theatrical.
it's like the Gulf of
It's a lot
Tonkin,
of
like the
trouble
Gulf.
where you could easily.
Yeah, well, it's like too. I mean, probably a better precedent. If the claim is that well, Bush and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and Doug Feith and Mr. Cheney, they all had this notion like we got to go to war and like how do we get a war mandate? The Gulf of Tonkin. I mean, however you feel about the Vietnam War and its intervention, I'm one of the few people who understands why the Vietnam War was fought, and the manner in which it was fought under Johnson was definitely not sound, but the war itself the intervention was in fact strategically sound. But the Gulf of Tonkin, the United States didn't like stage an attack on its own navy. Like what it did was it took an incident that didn't really happen, and creatively described it to reflect hostile engagement by the people's by the people's navy of North Vietnam. And lo and behold, like Johnson got his war mandate. It's yeah, I mean the whole thing is bizarre, and plus it's just people are bad at keeping secrets, and like yeah, there is a divide between civilians and law enforcement, and there's a huge divide between elites and regular people, but I mean, are you telling me that there's like not one guy? It's like there's not one guy who was involved in planting explosives at the World Trade Center in some capacity to blow it up. Who there's not one of those guys who like ever talked, or like just anybody in the know. I mean, like that seems to defy credibility, and yeah, nobody could ever articulate what the motivation would be. I'll tell you what's a far weirder case is the Oklahoma City bombing. And we should get into that sometime in a dedicated pod, but the only guy I know Alex Linder, who's kind of a nut, I'm not trying to say mean things about him, whether people agree with his methods or not. I mean, I don't want to get into that because it's not really within the scope, but Linder is an interesting guy in terms of some of his takes, and that's what he was constantly making that point that, look, if you want something that, first of all, like, the war on terror actually ensued under Clinton, and it did. That's when federal law enforcement got a lot of the tools that it enjoys today, in terms of its ability to kind of stretch the Fourth Amendment. But, the Oklahoma City bombing makes very little sense. That the federal government did not blow up, the Murat building, but I mean, there was a lot of dirty pool and a lot of lies around that. But yeah, the 9/11 truth thing is about the dumbest. QAnon, I think, is probably a little dumber, but the 9/11 truth thing was fucking really dumb.
It takes it to another level. But I don't think you'd have QAnon if there weren't all these baby steps to that world. People need to dive pretty deep, but they don't go right off the deep end. I'm sure you're right. You need to dig deeper and deeper, then you get there. Yeah.
Yeah, QAnon is just really weird. I'm sorry to keep going back.
It never made a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's totally.
No, it's great. Yeah. No, it's the weirdest thing where I've had people tell me the same. Like I've just met people like boomers and stuff just out and about in like Mesa and whatnot, just throughout my day, and I've met people who would tell me the same stuff. They'll be like, "Oh, Trump, he just got all this gold from underneath the Vatican. Did you hear about this?" And I'll be like, "Yeah, another guy just told me this." But it's like there's that many people.
Shit. Yeah.
They're all digging into the same weird stuff, and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" They'll be like, "Yeah, Lincoln actually turned the country into a corporation and blah blah blah, but now the debt's being due." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?"
And it always has to do,
you hear all this crazy QAnon stuff,
like legal minutia. Like you see, like if I declare myself a corporation and then a U.S. Navy flag from 1850, and I go into court, and I click my heels together and like tell the judge to suck my nuts, I don't ever have to pay taxes again.
Right.
It's like shit that makes no sense.
Right.
And no. Yeah. And then it's like it's always.
They remind me of It, like in Hawaii, there would be the sovereigntist people would always bring the same points. They'd be like, "Well, there was no treaty of annexation, or the treaty of annexation wasn't valid legally. So we're going to take this to court and we're going to get our kingdom back." It's like that's not gonna that's not how this works at all. Like court will be able to.
Also have some idea like
you're not going to pull that over.
They've got some like absurd like faith in like the power of the judiciary or something. It's like it's like look, okay,
yeah.
I could probably like somewhere, it's like even if I have to travel far and wide, I could probably find some like judge who's senile enough or like susceptible to a bribe who could like declare me to be like the Emperor of France. Like the fact like court, the fact like court is a declaratory judgment on something like means like jack and shit. It's like okay, go ahead and get. Yeah,
it doesn't just come into being
that you're like exempt from the income tax, and like let me know how that works. Like when the IRS like fucking audits you.
Right. I mean, it makes about no sense, but I mean that people are saying that Trump is you're only seeing his body double now, and he's commanding troops in the Pacific Ocean again. Like he's actually like leading military operations we don't know about.
That's taking on all kinds of iteration.
Like why?
Yeah, why would they bother? And like, what's the angle?
Yeah, I mean,
anyway? Yeah,
I just saw Trump. I mean, a couple weeks ago, people were like, "That wasn't Trump. You saw his
it's like,
body
who was
double."
it then?
Like, what? Okay, why was it? Why didn't he just go? Like, you went through all that trouble. Like, no
Well, it's like
one's
this
gonna
guy.
point that out. I mean,
One of those,
like Mike Lindell won't just tell people. But
one of those crappy. It might have been the Daily Mail. And like, I want to like the Daily Mail because like back in the day, like they were like pro Oswald Mosley, but now they're just like some fucking shit like UK tabloid. But like some years back, you probably noticed because I mean you were over there, but like Saddam had this like body double. Saddam had a body double, and so did like Uday Hussein, and like this dude was like Uday's body double. Like they interviewed him, and the guy had like a horrible life. Like basically, he like looked like almost exactly like Uday Hussein. It's like the Iraqi secret police just like kidnapped him, and they're like, "Yeah, like you're like Uday's body double now," and they like whooped his ass when he's like, "No, I'm not gonna do that." But basically, like he had to like fucking plate Uday Hussein for like 20 years. But he was like, basically, he's like, my only job was like fucking like take a bullet, like in lieu with a guy, or like when or like spoof, like Iranian intelligence.
it
or
wasn't
like,
as fun as it sounded. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like basically the dude's only role was like take a bullet for the real Uday. Like why is the fake Trump running around? Like what is his role?
Right.
Like just like fuck with people. Like I don't like
Right.
yeah. It seems like a lot of trouble. Like for not a whole lot of like there's not a whole lot of juice from that squeeze. I guess is what I'm getting at.
Right. Like, why are you doing all that to?
Yeah.
All right. I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't.
Right. We're about approaching.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
We're about hitting 30 minutes.
Here.
If
Yeah. We'll reconvene, man, in a couple hours. But yeah, this is dope.
Okay.
But yeah, well, whatever. If you want.
All right. Have you ever heard of this guy Fomenko?
What's his story? I don't think I may have. What's his story?
He's the Russian. He's a Russian mathematician, and he basically says that most of history is completely fake. Like it's like Benedictine monks came up with most of the stuff, but that most historical events are like they like made them up and kind of repeated them, or there might be truth to them, but they had to repeat them a second time. So it's like everything's told twice. And he says that he used math to figure this out, that the Earth is only, that the history is like 1,000 years old, about just over 1,000 years.
Yeah. I didn't know that originated with him, but I'm familiar with that school of thought. It's like a combination. It's a combination of kind of like a hollow Earth belief and prehistory and lost Atlantis type stuff, and just kind of numerology mysticism. It's very, very strange, and it makes sense that it's a Russian dude who's into that. Like I'm not saying that like trash for Russians. But there's a long tradition of very strange guy. Like the Mad Russian is a real thing. It's not just a kind of literary trope, and it's not just an archetype. Owing to the kind of rare personage of Rasputin, like there really is a very kind of peculiar mysticism that incorporates into it a lot of almost like science fiction type tropes. That's very Russian.
Yeah, it's found a lot of traction in Russia, and there's some Russian bias to his stuff, because he a lot of it he'll say that Russia actually is much more important in world history than what people say, and he'll say that like a lot of stuff like Genghis Khan, that was the Russians, and most of what Muslims did. He says Muslims were the same as Russian Orthodox for like the Crusades and so forth. These were actually Russians. And so he could dig up kind of strange evidence.
What's also he's probably riffing on. I mean, not riffing in terms of not riffing in terms of making fun of, but before a lot of these like theosophy types before they relied a lot on Dumazel, and Dumazel's totally legitimate. Dumazel, he's the father of the trifunctional hypothesis, and before long before the human genome was mapped, obviously. He was basically correct in positing that the origins of Indo-Aryan civilization being in the Caucasus, and you find these kind of like Russian national chauvinist types who claim that, like, oh, that means that, like, the father of civilization is Russian, and like stuff like that. So
Right.
that's yeah, that's interesting. Let's say there was some kind of basic insularity over the last 40,000 years, and but I mean, even if there hadn't been populations being displaced and replaced by conquest and the changing of ecology over time, social and environmental, like human populations change over time. It's there's something very silly and kind of pitiable about people who are worry that their race is unaccomplished or something, trying to declare that, like, oh, actually, we're the descendants of Ramses, we're the descendants of Caesar or something. But yeah, it's very much the same. I mean, don't get me wrong. Russia is a fascinating place, and Russia / Central Asia. The reason why it has a huge significance, not just the power of politics, but the human affairs in all kinds of ways. I mean, in some ways, it is the center of the world. In geostrategic terms, in basic economic terms, in some way too. I don't mean economics in terms of the conduct of business or something, but in terms of natural resources. If Central Asia was a continent unto itself, it would be the most it'd be the second most populous continent on the planet, with the bulk of the world's natural gas and petroleum reserves and things. I mean, so there's not I mean, obviously it's foolish, the kind of fantasies that people like this man you mentioned weave around it, but yeah, I'm the last person to suggest that Russia's an insignificant place, or that Central Europe is just some sort of primitive backwater. I mean, there are aspects of that, but there's also aspects of real greatness and everything in between, and yeah, it's the significance of the region.
I mean, it's a big
disdain.
Yeah, it's very mysterious, the whole Russian thing, because people can't figure even out what they really are, what a Russian is, or I mean, I think a lot of it is.
Well, it's also too. I mean, because you're a student. You're a student of not just of history, and you like military stuff, and you like German stuff like I do. When we talked about the history of Prussia, Prussia was they had an experience like the Prussian people. They were not initially indigenous there. There was this population of Slavs, the Wends, and some other populations that kind of little is known about. They were pagans, well past the first millennium AD, and they were ethnically cleansed. They were they were totally annihilated, essentially. And which happens. It's not something that's unusual, obviously. But the Russian people, it's probably a situation like that. And, there's some indigenous Aboriginal element that remained. But, like, the Russian people as they are now are the descendants of some conqueror race. And there's aspects of both cultures that are getting interstitially bound up. And it was so long ago that, what constituted autochthonic aspects of one or the other was kind of like lost to history and memory. Yeah, it's very, like, people's actual origins are generally very mysterious, but nowhere is that more so than on the steppe. And it's not only a lack of literacy. I mean,
because there's so many.
Like, yeah,
you'll see groups of pictures of Russians, and they'll all look kind of the same, and they're from like the same place, but they'll look different than anywhere else. But you have to just wonder, who are these? What's this tribe, or where they came from? And it could be any number of things. I mean, they'll have like a certain particular look, and even in general, I think it's kind of overblown when people act like a Russian is like an Aryan mixed with a Mongoloid, like Genghis Khan type thing. I don't think that. I think there's probably something to that, and I think DNA will show that, but it's overblown. I think
it's not the
Russians
whole
are
yeah, it is
a different thing. Yeah,
Well, it's also too
because
the
it's
key to understand. I mean, the Mongol Empire is fascinating for all kinds of reasons, and I mean, you and I share that interest, as we talked about, as well as like a reading, listening, comment on the subject. But the Mongol Empire, in terms of territory, it was the largest empire that ever existed. But it truly was, it truly was populated by a nomadic, basically this like roving army. You know what I mean? It's not as this idea that the Mongols just after being defeated at the gates of Vienna or whatever, the Mongols just settled and then kind of melted away into what's now Russia and Eastern Europe. That doesn't make sense. I mean, yeah, I'm sure.
no, they left very
yeah.
little like they left very little cultural trace, and people
Right.
act like that's like they had like some like neocon drive to like, or like some like
Yeah.
I don't know, like it's kind of weird because people like in Prodden's book, how he describes how people didn't really know what Mongols were at all. Like they figured it was like another Christian crusading empire coming to hit the Muslims from the east. They had no
Right.
idea what was really there. I mean, they didn't know it was in Africa either. So
Well, think about-
it's there's a lot of mysterious things going on, and I think that's why you get these conspiracies where you kind of pick up weird artifacts and put them, rearrange them in a way that there might be something to it, but
The
it's
kernel of truth
unexplored.
to a lot of
but-
this stuff. But I mean, well, think about it like this. Okay, think about if we're talking about the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s. Like the Mongol epoch. Okay, like roughly. Think about if you're a peasant on the steppe, or even like farther west. Okay, like think about if you're a European serf. These men arrive, like they're obviously Asiatic in appearance, and you've probably never been more than 20 miles from your village or whatever. They're expert horsemen. They fight in ways that you've never ever seen. Like that'd be as much of a shock to your senses and as confusing conceptually as when Mayans encountered conquistadors or whatever. And yeah, on
Right.
the one hand, those people they by that point become habituated to crusaders passing through at regular intervals. At least that was insinuated into their historical memory. But yeah, how would they have any idea from where these people truly emerged? And yeah, stuff like that. I mean, that's really the source of that really is the source of cultural narrative a lot of the time. Like somebody made the point, I can't remember who it was. It wasn't. I mean, Carlyle kind of obliquely makes this point, but there's a guy who wrote specifically about the pagan pantheons. Like one of the reasons they're not truly like religion, like Christianity or Islam, for all kinds of reasons. One of the ways that's one of the things that sets them apart is these figures like Odin. They were probably real guys. They're probably like warlords. In like the 3rd century or something. And like over time, they became like identified, with some kind of war god, and then like the legend of both personages like became synonymous. And that's and particularly when you got like a culture where the only record keeping is like oral tradition and kind of like ancestral memory. Like a lot of these things are going to become where primitive religiosity begins and collective memory ends is going to be a very blurred line. I mean, I think that was fascinating, at least.
Yeah, and I think all those kind of fit together. I mean, I would kind of think about how Marco Polo would just describe how different pagans he'd come across, and he'd just kind of remark that they these people burn their dead, and so just totally unfamiliar. But and then also a lot of it is just kind of the same, or even different pagans would kind of look at a different pantheon and be like, oh, okay, well that's Hermes right there. They fit a certain
Right.
archetype in a kind of a Carlyle kind of way.
Well, symbolic,
It's kind of interesting to see what some of the pagan stuff.
No, it's hugely important, man. Symbolic psychology is tremendously important. Like people tend to kind of they tend to kind of look down on Jungian thought now because people think it's like a hokey and whatever. And I mean, Jung was kind of reductionist in some of his claims, especially when he stepped outside his proverbial wheelhouse. But there was but I came to respect Jung more and more as I reread, Frank Herbert's stuff as an adult. And I realize it might sound silly to cite science fiction as some kind of meaningful academic resource, but one of the reasons, Herbert was a brilliant guy because the counterfactual scenarios he described in his epic novels really fleshed out a lot of sociological and psychological theorizing in a very concrete way. And basically the narrative that he presented was a modeling structure so that, the reader could apprehend these things. And symbolic psychology is hugely impactful on politics. I mean, this is all shot throughout Carl Schmitt's concept of political life. It's the core of Hobbesian theory, and whether one accepts or rejects Hobbes's kind of ontological account of man as a political animal, or as a political actor rather, I don't think it can be disputed that Hobbes had a certain brilliance for describing man's relationship to the state in psychological terms. And symbolic psychology is something that truly is universal, kind of like across racial and cultural lines. And it's kind of like the universal dialectic, okay? Because different as these representations may be in subjective characteristics, these representations all represent essentially the same things, the same basic forms, and that quite clearly is intrinsic to the structure of the human mind. Otherwise it would not be repeated. Like iterations of this phenomenon would not repeat, across generations perennially, but also wouldn't emerge in, everything from the most primitive, Bushman culture in sub-Saharan Africa, to the most advanced, society, in the global north or whatever. So yeah, that kind of stuff's tremendously important. It's not just, something of interest for people who, kind of enjoy like, thought experiments or theorizing on, kind of ancient mysteries of prehistory. No, I spend a lot of time with that stuff.
Yeah, I agree that Dune is good for like that. Like it's, I mean, science fiction is used very well for exactly that, because it kind of takes you out. You get to see things from different perspectives, especially like Dune Messiah or God Emperor of Dune. And I would think a lot about even theology and stuff when I would.
Hugely.
I would reflect back on Dune when
no, that
I don't know. It would just get you to think about. Yeah, it seems so alien at times, and it kind of it was kind of a transcendent world that he made. And
no, and it's truly brilliant, and it's entirely about human affairs. The only alien creatures in it are the sandworms, and the sandworms obviously originated on Earth, and over a millennia, like they mutated owing to environmental factors. But I mean, there's a reason for that.
It felt like you're the alien looking at humans.
Yeah,
is kind of how I'd almost take it.
No, indeed, and it's also, I mean,
it's like a different perspective of.
Yeah, from symbolic psychology, to historical memory, being lost over time, and how collective memory, becomes a religion unto itself, in primitive and even not so primitive societies. But also the way, like the Bene Gesserit, they literally try to engineer, part of their social engineering efforts. Obviously these things, are generational in nature. They think in 1,000-year increments about what they want to accomplish, because that's what one would have to do to truly shape the trajectory of history. If one, was possessed of such hubris, they thought they could do that. But they're one of the reasons the Fremen are susceptible to the messianic mythos is because that's been insinuated into their culture deliberately, by people who wish to conquer them. So I mean, the emergence of false gods, but I mean there would be there would be conquerors are constantly frustrated by the fact that they don't respond to these false prophets, and that's fascinating too. And that's very, very deep human ecology there, and that's why there's a hell lot of fiction that's just a waste of time. But again, like good science fiction, rare as it is,
I think with those big, with those big historical narratives, I think that always kind of blows people away. And even I think Christianity kind of caught on big because of the timeline. It made people very interested. A lot of people have commented on that it was really intriguing that you could present like from the beginning until the end, a very broad perspective. And Islam, bragged similarly that this gives you a broad perspective, not a narrow view. And communism, I think, caught on the same way because they had a big historical picture. And I think that's why people like some of the conspiracy stuff as well. And also why the science fiction kind of can work or Tolkien stuff where you make a whole
well, to that point,
world.
And yeah, you want to know something that I think is hugely significant, and I mean you know about this because I mean you're a Bible Protestant and you're well versed in Scripture, and you've read quite a bit on historicism and particularly Oswald Spengler. When Spengler talked about the prime symbols, and the kind of secondary iterations of the phenomenon in cultures, he talked about the Faustian prime symbol of infinite space. And he juxtaposed that with, the classical. He said that there's a lot to be gleaned from the fact that in these friezes, from Doric Athens and stuff, it's like this kind of like perfectly formed man, like a warrior and athlete, but he's standing, he's sensuously present, but he's standing in front of nothing. The present is what matters. The past is important too, and the future is something must consider. But, the Greek idea, the Greek cosmology was that the universe is perennial, it's eternal, and it's just always been here. It has no beginning, it has no end, it's infinite in the pure literal sense. So this idea that there was creation, and eventually this cycle of creation will end, that was not a concept that people just, instinctively had in their mind. And even people who are kind of ignorant, even people who consciously or just implicitly kind of reject the Christian paradigms, either on the social conditioning or whatever else they're up on. They take for granted Christian cosmology that people have always understood that there was a Big Bang or something. Like that's not the case at all. This idea that there was a time before there was reality. That's not something anybody really thought about. Except the earliest monotheists, like whoever the progenitors were, the Zoroastrian faith, and the Hebrews, the Old Testament, and obviously, Islam developed out of these same tendencies, but that's hugely important. The idea of a beginning and an end. I'd argue, like the Spenglerian point part is that Faustian man understands that he's literally racing against time. Because man is in cosmological terms too, not just political ones and personal ones in terms of individual lives. So yeah, go ahead, man. I'm sorry.
I was just kind of thinking, one weird one would be the Aboriginal Australians. Just because they have a beginning kind of they have a creation, but no, it's like that's it. So they always talk about the dream time. Yeah, there's no end, but
that's it.
And that kind of I think it kind of shapes them in who they are. That because they always refer to like the dream time, and you'd think it's like another world, but they're talking about the creation of the world. So it's like they always refer back to the creation, and then it's just now we live in like a poor state of that, and that's there's no end. It's just that's it.
That's really interesting.
That's the whole story.
Right.
It's a really strange one, and but they're kind of a particular people in themselves.
Oh yeah.
So it kind of reflects on their views and what they're susceptible to, but I think Spengler definitely. Oh no, go on.
Well, I was thinking about
I
excuse me, I'm sorry. I was reading a lot about the Colorado War. You know, that's where the Sand Creek incident happened, which was really a terrible incident. And I mean, I don't want to sidetrack on a tangent, but I, I I think Sand Creek was an incident where neither the cavalry, you know, nor the you know nor the dog soldiers wanted to fight, but you know, everybody was afraid, and then there was a weapons discharge, and then before you know it, a massacre happened. But I was thinking, I was reading about guys like Kit Carson, who, I mean, he's another one of these figures who cancel culture loves to attack, even though Kit Carson was probably the greatest friend that, like, Amerindians ever had. But, Kit Carson, one of his big things, he didn't just live among these people. He wasn't just like an expert tracker and great warrior. But his whole notion was, to try and kind of like document the culture of these people, of these Aboriginal elements. And, Carson kind of made the point that, even if you become fluent, in these Amerindian languages, conceptually there's things that truly don't translate. So I'm sure that some peoples, both, comparatively primitive and advanced, who no longer exist, I'm sure some of them held cosmologies, that were very, very advanced, and that probably did reflect a more linear view of creation, but that this was never documented, or such that it was documented. It was not in any conceptually complete way translated to modern language. And even if it was, even though it's perfect translation, there's conceptual aspects that are missing if one's not truly insinuated into the culture and doesn't properly appreciate, kind of like the implicit meaning of certain words, or the subtle emotional content that such things are tailored to evoke. So I think about that a lot. Probably because I'm like a words guy. I mean, that's why that's why I peck at my keyboard all day, because that's the medium that I'm not as comfortable with. That's like the way my mind is wired to think. Just like guys who build things, they're wired to think about things in, kind of concrete architectural terms, geometric terms. That's all I wanted to get out.
Yeah, you see that a lot where the cosmology really can evolve, where you don't know if it always was kind of like what you're looking at. I mean that goes back to you don't know if what people. I mean, like in Hawaii, there were the Hawaiians. It's indigenous, but in the Hawaiian, all their myths, they talk about the people who were there before them, who they wiped out.
Interesting.
And that
because they were the conquerors, yeah.
Right, and then different people kind of look at that and who these guys were showing up, and kind of you can see how they had different religious views, kind of always changing. They weren't as static as people kind of would present them now, where if people try to build back a paganism, it becomes like a static thing, but it wasn't necessarily before. And I know actually the SS put a lot of thought into stuff like that, with that like Villigut, and where he would say that his whole thing was that he dug in and he said, well, the Germans were pagan, but before that they actually had like a monotheistic religion,
right?
Which was and so he was kind of trying to show all the stuff from language and from his own intuition and what I mean, he was definitely kind of a quack, but there was a big interest in digging those layers kind of back.
Well, there's a great book on him.
What the furthest ancestors kind of thought.
Yeah, there's a great book on him called The Secret King, Himmler's Lord of the Runes, and it's by Stephen Edward Flowers. And he was buddy with Michael Moynihan, like the guy from Blood Axis. But Villigut, I mean, yeah, some of that stuff is very eccentric. But I was talking on the pod the other week, not on the pod. I was talking to Jack Burton on his pod, and he wanted to talk about Ernst Jünger. And I made the point that Jünger was in the tradition of Meister Eckhart, and there really is a tradition of German mysticism. most embodied by people like Eckert. And Villegut was very much part of that. And Himmler, being a Bavarian Catholic, albeit, a city slicker from Munich, whose, family mingled with the lesser nobility. This was not Himmler just being some crazy man who wanted to play Vikings or something. There's a lot of, like, theosophy and kind of strange New Age, occultism was a big thing in the early 20th century. Just across the board. But in Germany proper, or rather in Germany specifically, there is a tradition of mysticism that runs very deep. Villigut's not a guy who can just be dismissed outright. There's a reason why, too, Villigut was a war hero. He had a very interesting life. I realize there's plenty of crazy guys who are great under fire, but, Villigut, I don't go in for, like, neo-pagan, stuff at all. But Villigut was, he was not, it's not fair to just lump Villigut in with that intellectual camp. Okay, I highly recommend the Stephen Edward Flowers book. It's called The Secret King. For anyone listening who wants to get up on that.
I like it.
Yeah, hell yeah, you know about it. I figured you would, man. Yeah, it's dope.
Yeah. But like Jung was kind of, he was so many different kind of things, and he kind of changed his views over and over. He was into astrology for a while, and he was into theology actually for quite a bit. But I think getting back to Spengler, that you could see a real drive towards Russia with him, and I think kind of some of the other tendency with Prussians in general, which I think is Russophilic in a way, more than people say it's anti-Russia. But I think that his whole drive is that something with Russia had to be big. Something will change there. That's where there's he says that's where there's barbarians. So, but
Russia
it's
is the axial pivot of.
It seemed to a lot of people that there's same as World War II. The whole war was basically about getting that the Lebensraum in that exact territory, and we're talking about resettling Germans into Crimea and stuff like that. And it's huge. Everyone saw the value of how that would change the whole world. And I think it's what the war now is about too, more than anything else.
No,
it's
it is
more than
it
about
is.
people in Donbass or whatever.
Well, consider this. Consider this. I cite Eric Hobsbawm periodically, which people think is weird because he was an unreconstructed Stalinist throughout his entire life, and in some ways he was kind of like a typical obnoxious, pedantic, left Hegelian, but he did have certain insights, and he's the one who popularized the terminology of referring to the 20th century as the quote short century, because he said that in the 19th century, after Waterloo, not much happened. There's the Crimean War in Europe, and there was the 1848 revolutions. But the only major conflict was the U.S. war with the States. Okay, and the political structure, again, save the 1848 revolutions, was basically stable. He had the short century as 1914 to 1989, which was incredibly violent. It was world transformative in ways that only probably emerge, once in a millennia, if that. But the entire 20th century revolves around Russia and the question of Russia, and its ascendancy to superpower status, its ability to shape the conceptual horizon of the developing world, its ability to challenge Europe, and then America for global supremacy. And even today, like I was talking to on the pod with Joel the other day, you're exactly right. What truly underlies this crusade against Russia, there's people who, for ideological reasons, for ethno-sectarian historical reasons, hate the Russians and just, view Russia as kind of their existential enemy no matter what. But This is about
Right.
Europe.
I think
It's about. I mean,
right.
Europe. It's about,
I think
yeah. Go ahead.
things got kind of blurred. I think the lines got kind of blurred where the Russians adopted communism. So people say it's about the communism, the ideological conflict there. So the Cold War is shaped like that. But actually, I think a lot of Russians are not wanting to really look at it like that because they may have ascended with communism, but they didn't see because you wouldn't want to say, well, we were something. They say it was just Russia on the ascent,
No, exactly.
not
What
necessarily
Marxism
do with.
was. No, exactly. Bolshevism was the catalyst by which Russia entered the modern world in political and sociological terms. You're absolutely right. And yeah, the conflict today, it's about decoupling Europe from Russia, because the only way Europe becomes independent from America and becomes a superpower in its own right is with some kind of permanent concord with Russia. Whether that's whether that's the German Reich, conquering Lebensraum there and incorporating Russia's vast resources into its own dominion, or whether it's or whether it's Europeans becoming entirely dependent on Russian energy, but then Russia being able to access European capital, in terms of payment for the commodities provided and other things. But the United States is not going to allow complex interdependence between Europe and Russia. And that's what underlies that's what underlies the war today. So yeah, so once again, even Russia continues to kind of be the geostrategic axial pivot of power political around which power political activity orbits. And yeah, that cannot be denied.
I think this is one way where Russia is going back to Fomenko. Why stuff like that ties in so well with Russia is because they're looking for alternative narratives, and so they're looking for like maybe secret narratives. And I think Russians are already kind of susceptible to that kind of thinking.
Yeah, esoteric stuff. Yeah,
I think you do see kind of just weird esoteric things and stuff like that, or even just making stuff up. I mean, they will do that. I think some of the propaganda they've come out like where I think like the protocols comes to mind, where it's like they write this, but why? What was the point of this fabrication?
Well, interestingly, I didn't know this until fairly recently. The Tsarist state was pretty fascinating, and it played it was a huge catalyst for World War I. I mean, obviously, but people are so focused on kind of the Western Front and the German Empire. Franz Joseph, the Habsburg Emperor, I think is about one of the most compelling figures of the war. People don't deal with the Habsburg Empire in any meaningful way, in pop history. And they also don't deal with the Russian Empire and the Tsarist regime. And in the modern era, the Russian Empire, they're tremendously ambitious, like on a par with the way the Soviet state was. I mean, although conceptually, the nuances as well as the kind of conceptual lingua franca had changed. But the Tsar actually had a secret police force. I can't remember what the acronym is now, but this kind of tendency towards legerdemain and secret policing, and an entire culture of secret police elements, and propaganda and disinformation, as well as kind of crafting narratives out of whole cloth that serve a political and sociological purpose. This goes way back. There's something intrinsic to Russian political culture that produces that. It's not just something that emerged with Sovietism, and it's not just something today that's sort of like a vestigial echo of the Soviet period. Yeah, you're absolutely right, man. It's a really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, Was it the Okrana?
That sounds something like
Does
that.
that sound
Yeah,
familiar?
yeah.
I don't know. I don't
It
know.
was like a proper secret
That
police
sounds
force. Like,
familiar.
it's not just a metaphor or something. Like that's what
Who-
these guys were.
Whoever Stalin was running from or whatever.
Yeah. Exactly. Like all the European empires, like monarchies had, some kind of like political bureau like that, dealt with like on the enforcement side. But this was like a proper like secret police force. They were involved in
Yeah.
they were involved in very kind of like 20th century like activities. Or what we characterize as kind of the things that emerged far later in regimes that kind of developed out of the ashes of monarchism, not that attended monarchist regimes in their epoch.
It's interesting that with like Theosophy, that's where Blavatsky's from too.
Yeah.
Russia. So
yeah,
I
no,
don't
the
know.
stuff isn't
There's
accidental.
something to that.
That's also why that's one of the reasons. There's something. I mean, Spengler had a very complex and nuanced view of Russia and what Sovietism meant. You guys had Francis Yaki, but something that one of the reasons it's peculiar that the communist heartland became Moscow. I mean, for all kinds of reasons. I mean that I don't think need to be revisited because they're obvious. But culturally, that dialectical materialism seems uniquely at odds with kind of the Russian national character and the indigenous religiosity. It's very weird, and I noticed that I read a lot about the Soviet space program because it was tremendously significant as well as and just important in strategic military terms, obviously during the Cold War, but. There's a weird mysticism and a kind of like cosmology, at least in symbolic terms, that surrounded the way the Soviet people like looked at the space program. I mean, obviously, like any discussion of space, its exploration, or military activities therein, or or anything to do with it is gonna provoke thoughts about God and uh and and cosmological things, quite literally. But it seemed like one step further in Russia in terms of kind of the national dialogue. And this was at the zenith kind of
Yeah.
a post-Stalinist secularism. So that's very interesting. Russia is definitely
It's almost like yeah, it's like when you make it a purely materialistic thing, but then you're like replacing religion with rockets. But then the people are already kind of tend towards religiosity. I mean, that's what Yaki's view was. He said it was never a Marxist nation. It is entirely, they just took it as like a religious thing, because their character is religious. So
yeah, it's political theology.